Hi class, I hope you all had a good October holidays. We had a really nice week off and we're now back and we are back to carry on reading of the book. I will print out some pages because I know some of my classes are loving to read out loud, which is brilliant. I'm excited to hear you read. And for now, I will be reading. Again, Harley and Bella are in here, but they're both being quite quiet. But Alvin, the chipmunk, has just come out of the cage and he's eating some nuts, so you might occasionally hear him. He's looking over at me now. You might occasionally hear him squirreling away on some nuts. Okay, so we're at chapter Having Tea at 6:49 p.m. Alfie sat at the kitchen table again, picked up his knife and fork and said again loudly, "I'll just do what I like." Since they had just stopped time, he assumed these were magic words, so he expected on saying them something magical to happen. But perhaps disappointingly, even though a minute before this is exactly what he wanted, Mrs. Stokes appeared in front of him. "Oh, hello," he said. "So," she said, "what would that be?" "I beg your pardon," said Alfie. "What would that be in this particular case, eh? Come on, Alfie, don't be dense. What, seated as you are at the kitchen table with your knife, fork, and plate at the ready, would you like to do?" Alfie frowned, not just because he was thinking about answering the question, although he was, but also because he had noticed something about Mrs. Stokes. She had come into the room very quickly and was standing up straighter than she had before, and she was speaking to him in a loud and crackly voice without seeming to hear any of his words wrong and without her hearing aids feeding back. And her Zimmer frame, if Alfie wasn't mistaken, was lighting up in colour. It was like it had been secretly put together from a batch of different coloured lightsabers, red and blue and yellow and green, and she'd only now just switched them on. He said, "I'd like to eat some candy floss." "Okay, just usual candy floss, or I'd like it in the shape of a rocket." "Excellent. Now we're getting to the spirit of things. Anything to go with that?" Chips. Rocket candy floss and chips." Mrs. Stokes seemed to concentrate. The colours of her Zimmer frame started flashing, and suddenly there it was, in front of him on the table, a tube of the pinkest, fluffiest candy floss, shaped exactly like the Apollo 13, the rocket ship that Alfie most liked from when they had done the history of the moon landings at school. The chips were built up next to it, a huge side ladder of them, crisscrossing all the way to the top. It was incredible. Although one weird thing was that beneath the candy floss rocket there was some mash. Said Alfie, prodding at it with his fork. "Aren't chips enough, potato?" "That's smoke," said Mrs. Candyfloss. Said Mrs. Candyfloss. "No, that's smoke," said Mrs. Stokes from the lift off. "Brilliant," said Alfie. "Anything to drink?" she added. "Perhaps something that could help power the rocket?" I don't really want to drink oil." "No, but it could look a bit like oil." Alfie had a thought. "Well, I've always wondered why no one makes a fizzy chocolate drink." Mrs. Stokes clicked her fingers and a glass appeared next to his plate, full of something brown, creamy, and sparkling. "Enjoy," she said. Clearing up after tea, 6:49 p.m. The strange thing about that tea, which might seem in dietary terms a little sugary and heavy, it wasn't. Every bit of the candy floss rocket that entered Alfie's mouth seemed to change its levels of sweetness so it never became overpowering. The fizzy chocolate went down like a smooth treat, and the chips were really light and fluffy and not too greasy. "It's all organic," said Miss Stokes, which seemed unlikely in the case of candy floss chips and fizzy chocolate. But then again, it was magic candy floss chips and fizzy chocolate, thought Alfie, so there might be a special exemption. When he finished his tea, he said, "What's next?" "What do you mean? What routine's next?" "Oh," said Alfie, clearing up after tea. "Okay," said Mrs. Stokes. "If you were to go about that just as you liked, how would you do it?" Alfie thought. His first instinct was to say he wouldn't do it at all, but he felt that would be rude or possibly ungrateful. So he said, "Plates are a little bit like flying saucers, aren't they?" "They are," said Mrs. Stokes. "How do flying saucers fly, Mrs. Stokes?" "They're round and all their jets seem to be underneath, so how do they fly anywhere but upwards?" "Well," said Mrs. Stokes, her face lit by the flashing Zimmer frame, They may have a propulsion system that creates an anti-gravity effect which curves the jet streams in infinitive directions. Or it may just be, she added, as Alfie's plate floated into the air, magic. The plate hovered in front of Alfie's face, glowing. Then it twirled around. Uh-oh, said Alfie. What? Uh-oh, said Mrs. Stokes. What? Said Alfie. Mrs. Stokes nodded towards the table. The salt and pepper shakers were trembling. They blasted off up towards the plate, followed closely by the bottom of the bottle of the tomato ketchup, which also suddenly risen in the air with an enemy rocket ship. The dark forces of the condiments are coming, shouted Mrs. Stokes. Alfie picked up his knife and fork and held them up vertically like a comic book picture of a boy expecting food. He levered the knife towards the fork and the fork backwards. Go, warp, factor 1, hyperspeed. The plate zoomed away from his face. Alfie manipulated his knife and fork backwards and forwards and sideways, making the plate zigzag its way through the attacking salt and pepper shakers and enemy rocket ship ketchup. Expertly, he controlled the path of the plate up towards a lampshade, along the dining room wall, and past the canvas photos of him when he was a baby that he wished his parents would take down. It occurred to him that he could crash the plate into that and destroy it, but he felt that was going just too far with doing what he liked. But the shakers and the ketchup speeded up. The condiments were right behind. Alfie, shouted Mrs. Stokes, the plate's not going to make it. It's going to get salt and peppered and ketchuped. Alfie knew what to do. He threw his knife and fork towards the plate. They whirled around at high speed like wheels in the air, overtaking the salt and pepper shakers and arching past the ketchup bottle. Still rotating incredibly fast, they spun themselves on the side of the plate, giving that little bit of extra speed it needed to get to the dishwasher, which Mrs. Stokes opened just in time for the plate and the knife and the fork to separate and drop into the right parts of the rack. Fabulous, she said. What about your glass? I think I'm just going to be okay to bring that over, said Alfie. Okay. Homework. 6:49 still p.m. Clocks have not changed. Alfie looked at the book he was meant to read. It was big, heavy, and called Marine Biology, an introduction. Can we just make this one disappear, said Alfie. Yes, why not, said Mrs. Stokes, picking it up. You'll probably find out what you need to know about this somewhere or another anyway. With that, she put the book down and walked through to the living room. Hang on, said Alfie, following her. Isn't the book actually going to disappear? Well, it hasn't it? Said Mrs. Stokes, looking around. I can't see it. Now what? She said, looking down at the copy of the routines she was holding. Ah, my favourite. She picked up the remote control and switched on the TV. Okay, so that is the end of those chapters. And we are going to be back in class, and you'll see I have a very big machine at the front, and we will be doing something with that today to do with the chapters we just read. Right, guys, see you in a sec. Bye. Oh, it's not stopped.